Hello, my name is Luke Allen Johnson the First, and I'm joined by my good friend today. Jennifer, what's your full name?
Jennifer Lynn Avery.
Really?
Yes.
I love that middle name. Jennifer is an editor, tutor, writer. She can help you with a bunch of stuff. How can people get in touch with you if they want to take advantage of your services?
They can email me at javerysce@gmail.com. And again, that is javerysce@gmail.com. And I can edit your book or your poetry. I can teach you some skills for creative writing, grammar, and literature.
Yes, she can. She was actually, I should have been paying you. You were giving me some writing advice off camera before we started earlier. How much, figure out how much I owe you. So my name is Luke Johnson, building this humanities teaching app called Noetic. Go download it. You can watch this live stream on YouTube. I'll have the better version of the audio up later and I'm going to improve the audio just in general. So, I've been meaning to get around to that. It's just kind of a lot of work. But today we are talking about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. What installment are we on? I've
I
lost
think
track.
we're on 7 maybe. 7.
We'll figure it out. 7 or 8.
It's around in there somewhere.
Well, let's cover a lot of ground today and talk about really important things.
Okay.
Go.
All right, so we're at chapter 19 right now, and this is in part 1, and Lizzie has they've just gone to the Netherfield ball, and everybody's really happy because Jane and Mr. Bingley seem to really be hitting it off, and that seems to be going well. But Lizzie's a little bit uncomfortable because she's beginning to think that maybe Mr. Collins, remember their kind of idiot cousin, might have some ideas about her. And in chapter 19 we find out that he absolutely does, and to the point that he actually asks her to marry him. And it takes him about a page and a half to actually propose. And he lists a number of... First he lists the reasons why he feels like he wants to get married. And, of course, prominent among these reasons is that Lady Catherine de Bourgh thinks it's a good idea that he get married. And he tells her also that why he wants to marry her is mainly because she is a member of the Longbourn family, which is the estate that he is going to inherit when Mr. Bennet dies. So essentially, in a remarkably unromantic proposal, Mr. Collins basically tells Lizzie that he wants to get married because Lady Catherine told him to, because he feels bad about inheriting Longbourn, even though it's not his fault at all, and that he's choosing her because she seems to have because she seems to be a sensible girl, and although Lizzie is a sensible girl, the fact of the matter is it should immediately strike the reader that Lizzie is way too smart for him. And he is way too dumb for her. And he's very hoity-toity about he's overly mannered. He's overly he's a sycophant, essentially. And Lizzie is the last person who's going to be a sycophant. And so this is obviously a bad match. But that doesn't stop Mr. Collins, because he basically, the only reason that he's asking her is because she's the second oldest and the second prettiest, and Jane seemed to be involved with Mr. Bingley, and that's the only reason he's asking her. So in any case, he comes to it, and like I said, it takes him a page and a half to actually propose, and she and of course she immediately says no. She says, she's, and again, back in these days, there was a formula to accepting or rejecting a marriage proposal. Like, you have to say, well, I thank you for the honor of this, but, or something like that. And that's what Lizzie does. She's very polite about it, and she says, oh, okay, well, I can't, it's impossible for me to do otherwise than decline them, is what she says. And Mr. Collins, though, idiot that he is like, oh, well, I know that most women will refuse a man at least 2 or 3 times before she actually accepts, because so that she can excite his affection for her. And Lizzie is just like, no. I actually mean what I say. Basically, Mr. Collins is subscribing to the stereotype that women are coquettish and like to play games. And that's something that, as a woman myself, greatly bothers me. And of course it bothers Lizzie too, because remember, although there's not quite as much feminism in Jane Austen as there is in like Charlotte Bronte, there's still some feminism here. There's some early feminism here. Lizzie is an independent woman. She has her own mind. She's very intelligent, and she makes her own decisions. And so in any case, he's falling victim to this stereotype that women will refuse a couple of times before they actually accept a man that they actually want to marry. And Lizzie says, no, you're crazy. I'm not doing this. And
she's like, this is not one of those times.
This is not one of those times. And what's so funny, poor Elizabeth, she tries a dozen different ways to tell him no, to the point that maybe he'll actually hear it and accept it. And the only thing that gets close is, nay, were your friend Lady Catherine to know me, I am persuaded she would find me in every respect ill qualified for the situation. And here Mr. Collins gets very grave, she says. Were it certain that Lady Catherine would think so, said Mr. Collins very gravely, but I cannot imagine that her ladyship would at all disapprove of you, and you may be certain that when I have the honour of seeing her again, I shall speak in the highest terms of your modesty, economy, and other amiable qualifications. And he, of course, he doesn't know anything of these things. And really, Lizzie's not that modest. She knows she's smart. She knows she's pretty. She's not that modest. And so he obviously doesn't even know this girl. But I say the only thing that gets close to affecting him is Lady Catherine might not like it. But he still kind of deludes himself into thinking that she's somebody that she's not. But in any case, and even after she tells him, I'm not the kind of woman who's going to refuse somebody, no, without actually meaning it. He keeps on. He persists. And he says, well, the next time that we talk about it, then I hope that I'll get a better answer. And Elizabeth is just about at her wit's end here, and she says, if what I have hitherto said can appear to you in the form of encouragement, I know not how to express my refusal in such a way as may convince you of its being one. And even after that, he doesn't persist, or he persists, and he says, as I must therefore conclude that you are not serious in your rejection of me, I shall choose to attribute it to your wish of increasing my love by suspense, according to the usual practice of elegant females. Again, the stereotype. And Lizzie, I love this response. So she's like, I do assure you, sir, that I have no pretensions whatever to that kind of elegance which consists in tormenting a respectable man. Amen, sister. I would rather be paid the compliment of being believed sincere. Yes, thank you, Lizzie. And and that's pretty much her final word. But Mr. Collins still persists, and all she can do at that point is just leave the room. And she leaves him just standing there and goes to her father, who she thinks is going to make him believe what she means. And she says, to such perseverance and willful self-deception, Elizabeth would make no reply, and immediately and in silence withdrew, determined that if he persisted in considering her repeated refusals as flattering encouragement to apply to her father, whose negative might be uttered in such a manner as must be decisive, and whose behavior at least could not be mistaken for the affectation and coquetry of an elegant female. And so that ends chapter 19 with Lizzie going to see her father. And when she leaves the room, and she just kind of goes upstairs for a minute to collect herself. And Mrs. Bennet is out in the vestibule right outside the door, wanting to see what happens, because she knows what's up. And she sees Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins is still so deluded and such an idiot that he thinks that everything that has transpired between he and Lizzie is a good thing, that she's actually going to accept him.
You know what? You're a little too tangled up in this story. Something tells me you had a Mr. Collins at one point. Am I right or am I right?
No, I haven't had a Mr. Collins. I wouldn't have the patience for a Mr. Collins. I would be like, I'd go on one date with a Mr. Collins and say, no, dude. Sorry, buddy, you're sweet and all, but no. but the thing that bothers me, and what I think Austen's trying to point out, is that, especially in the Regency era, when this was taking place, and when you were a gentlewoman, it was scandalous if you refused a marriage proposal from somebody who was deemed eligible, which means that they had the right name and the right money and the right connections. That's all that means. And I think that Austen saw it as just a ridiculous state of affairs, because women were expected to say yes to any man like that, whether he was an idiot or not, whether she cared about him or not, whether he was, it didn't, like, the personality it wasn't even secondary. It wasn't in the equation. And so I think that's the main problem I have with it. And I think what she's trying to point out is it's ridiculous to expect a woman, a thinking, feeling woman, to say yes to somebody just because he's got enough money. And so that's why I get kind of fired up about it. but in any case, coming into chapter 20, like I said, Mrs. Bennet's out there, and Mr. Collins, again, he's so deluded that he thinks that everything went well. But after Mr. Collins tells Mrs. Bennet what she said, Mrs. Bennet knows Lizzie well enough to know that she means what she says. And so Mrs. Bennet is immediately concerned. And this is good too. Mrs. Bennet says that Lizzie shall be brought to reason. I will speak to her about it myself directly. She is a very headstrong, foolish girl, and does not know her own interest, but I will make her know it. And pardon me for interrupting you, madam, cried Mr. Collins, but if she is really headstrong and foolish, I know not whether she would altogether be a very desirable wife to a man in my situation, who naturally looks for happiness in the marriage state. If therefore she actually persists in rejecting my suit, perhaps it were better not to force her into accepting me, because if liable to such defects of temper, she could not contribute much to my felicity. So being headstrong, or knowing yourself, essentially, is perceived as a defect. No thank you. But any case, and that's just further proof that Mr. Collins is just not the right dude for Lizzie. And that he doesn't even know her. Because he's like, oh, is she really headstrong and foolish? Oh, well, I didn't know that. You know? But in any case, so at this point, Mrs. Bennet sent a tizzy. And she's like, no, and she goes to Mr. Bennet. And she's thinking that Mr. Bennet is going to be of the same opinion and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins. But she goes in there, and Mr. Bennet, who, as we've discussed, he's a very smart man, a very clever man, and he doesn't have much patience for idiocy, which his wife is kind of an idiot. But in any case, Mrs. Bennet goes in there and says, oh, well, we're all in a tizzy. Mr. Collins asked Lizzie to marry him, and she said no. And now Mr. Collins is saying he won't marry her. And of course, Mr. Bennet's like, what? and he finally, and Mrs. Bennet tries to talk him into talking Lizzie into marrying Mr. Collins, and so Mr. Bennet just says, okay, we'll bring Lizzie to me. And Lizzie shows up, and Mr. Bennet just kind of clears everything up, and he says to Lizzie, very well, we now come to the point. Your mother insists upon your accepting it. Is it not so, Mrs. Bennet? Yes, or I will never see her again. An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do. And so it's a little bit mean to Mrs. Bennet, but it's exactly what Elizabeth wants, because and Mrs. Bennet knows that Lizzie is Mr. Bennet's favorite. Okay, and I think that it's already been established that Lizzie is the favorite for Mr. Bennet and the least favorite for Mrs. Bennet, because she's so clever and witty. And so when he says that, Mrs. Bennet knows immediately that she has no hope of winning this argument. And so she just flies into all manner of despair. And again, she's completely confused that he even said this, because she thinks that he's going to agree with her, but of course he doesn't. And not long out, and with that concluded, he basically throws everybody out of his library so he can have some peace. And after all of that, Mrs. Bennet keeps on pitching a fit, and throughout all of this, Charlotte Lucas comes in. And so Lizzie's talking to Charlotte Lucas, and let's see, where am I at? I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. And so Mrs. Bennet tries to get Charlotte to talk some sense into Lizzie, and Charlotte doesn't really answer her, because that's when Lizzie and Jane come in. And when Lizzie and Jane come in, Mrs. Bennet says, there she comes, looking as unconcerned as may be, and caring no more for us than if we were at York, provided she can have her own way. But I tell you what, Miss Lizzie, if you take it into your head to go on refusing every offer of marriage in this way, you will never get a husband at all. and I am sure I do not know who is to maintain you when your father is dead. I shall not be able to keep you, and so I warn you. I have done with you from this very day. I told you in the library, you know, that I should never speak to you again, and you will find me as good as my word. I have no pleasure in talking to undutiful children, not that I have much pleasure indeed in talking to anybody. People who suffer as I do from nervous complaints can have no great inclination for talking. Nobody can tell what I suffer, but it is always so. Those who do not complain are never pitied. And so Mrs. Bennet is as deluded as Mr. Collins is, essentially. And she says, I don't take any pleasure in talking, but she keeps on. And keeps on and keeps on. And so that's a perfect little nutshell for Mrs. Bennet's personality. And so, well, she's flipping out. And in comes Mr. Collins. And Mr. Collins officially withdraws his intentions to his engagement to Lizzie, or his proposal to Lizzie, and let me see where is it? Okay. Yeah, here's this. My conduct may, I fear, be objectionable in having accepted my dismission from your daughter's lips instead of your own. But we are all liable to error. I have certainly meant well through the whole affair. My object has been to secure an amiable companion for myself with due consideration for the advantage of all your family. And if my manner has been at all reprehensible, I here beg leave to apologize, which is all he ever does is apologize. But to translate this into modern English, is he's basically saying, I feel like I have made a mistake in accepting Lizzie's refusal from her lips instead of yours. So yes, back in that day, parents could force daughters to marry men. And he's basically saying that I shouldn't have listened to her, I should have listened to you. Which is, again, just a gross abuse of a thinking, feeling woman, in my opinion. It's just like she's not smart enough to think for herself. She doesn't have the right to think for herself. You should be thinking for her, is what that basically is. And so, but that's the end of chapter 20. And so, let me see here. And chapter 21, more of this continues. Like, Mrs. Bennet's still freaking out. Mrs. Bennet's still really unhappy with Lizzie, but a little bit of peace is kind of taken over. Mr. Collins is still there, and he's just not talking to Lizzie, but he does start talking to Charlotte Lucas. And this is going to be very important later. And Elizabeth is relieved. Like, she feels grateful to Charlotte for bearing the brunt of Mr. Collins. And so she's perfectly fine with it. And the next day, the girls decide to go into Meryton, into town, and there they meet Mr. Wickham. Now, if you remember, Mr. Wickham is the feller that Darcy supposedly used very ill. And Mr. Wickham tells Elizabeth basically why he wasn't at the Netherfield ball. And he says, I found, as the time drew near, that I had better not meet Mr. Darcy. That to be in the same room, the same party with him for so many hours together might be more than I could bear, and that scenes might arise unpleasant to more than myself. And so the way that he's phrasing this, it makes it sound like Mr. Darcy would cause a scene. But he kind of tells on himself by saying more than I could bear. And then he says that scenes might arise unpleasant. So, why would Mr. Darcy cause a scene with somebody who he had already used in this way? Wouldn't he be, wouldn't the injured party be more likely to cause a scene? And so basically he's admitting that he might have caused a scene himself, which to me would be a hint that I don't know about this dude. But Lizzie doesn't see it. She says she highly approved his forbearance. And so they talk about it while they're walking in Meryton, and then Mr. Wickham and his fellow officer walk the girls back to Longbourn, back to their house, and there Mr. Wickham meets the parents. But not much happens there. They leave not long after that. And in the middle of all of this, Jane gets a letter from Netherfield, which is where Mr. Bingley lives. And she reads this letter from Caroline Bingley, and Lizzie notices that while she's reading it, she looks really unhappy and tense and anxious. And so after the men have gone, they go upstairs to talk about it. And by the way, this is something that people do to this day, is they get like an email or a message from somebody, and they sit there and break it down sentence by sentence to try to figure out what's going on. And that's what they're doing. Is Jane and Lizzie are trying to figure out what this letter means for her and Mr. Bingley. And so they find out that Miss Bingley and her sister, we find out that Mr. Bingley had gone to London a few days before. And now the women are going after him to join him, and nobody's going to be left in Netherfield. And so the fact that the ladies are going with him suggests that he might not be back for a while. And Miss Bingley puts in there, let me see here. Okay, she says that she's following Mr. Bingley to London. But at first Elizabeth's like, well, that doesn't mean that Mr. Bingley won't come back. The ladies might stay in London, but he might come back because it is his house, and there's nothing untoward in that. And so, and so Elizabeth's not really worried about it. But then Jane says, "Oh, wait a minute. There's something else in here that you might want to hear before you make that judgment." Miss Caroline Bingley says, "When my brother left us yesterday, he imagined that the business which took him to London might be concluded in 3 or 4 days. But as we are certain it cannot be so, and at the same time convinced that when Charles gets to town he will be in no hurry to leave it again, we have determined on following him thither, that he may not be obliged to spend his vacant hours in a comfortless hotel." So she says that they're going so that he'll have a house, Mr. Hurst's house, to stay in. Many of my acquaintance are already there for the winter. I wish I could hear that you, my dearest friend, had any intention of making one in the crowd, but of that I despair. So she's making an assumption that Jane's not going to be anywhere in London. I sincerely hope your Christmas in Hertfordshire may abound in the gaieties. So basically, all of this is suggesting that they're all going to be gone for a long time. They're all going to be gone through the whole winter, and when we're still in summer here, I think. And Lizzie is still not convinced. Jane says it's evident by this that he comes back no more this winter, and Lizzie says it is only evident that Miss Bingley does not mean he should. And we find out a little bit later that Lizzie ain't wrong about any of this. But sweet little Jane she doesn't want to think badly of anybody. And she likes the Bingley sisters, and she thinks that they're very kind and pleasant to be around, and so she doesn't want to think ill of them. But Lizzie, she can see underneath all of this, and then Jane and Lizzie is still saying, well, that doesn't mean anything, and then Jane says, well, wait a minute, I haven't read everything to you. And she comes to this part of the letter in which Caroline Bingley suggests that that her brother, Mr. Bingley, has feelings for Mr. Darcy's sister, Miss Darcy. And then she goes on to say that this would be a union that would secure the happiness of so many. So basically she's saying that Charles wants to marry Miss Darcy and we want him to marry her too. And so that basically completely shuts Jane out of the whole equation. And again, Lizzie is not convinced. She says, Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She follows him to town in hope of keeping him there and tries to persuade you that he does not care about you. And again, Lizzie ain't wrong. And she keeps trying to convince Jane that it's possible that this is what's going on. You need to understand this is what's going on. And sweet little Jane is like, oh well, my best hope is that Caroline has deceived herself about this, and Lizzie keeps on and says, but in this, the case is this: we are not rich enough or grand enough for them, and she is more anxious to get Miss Darcy for her brother from the notion that when there has been one intermarriage, she may have less trouble in achieving a second, which means if Miss Darcy was married to Mr. Bingley, then Miss Bingley could marry Mr. Darcy. It'd be easier for that to happen if were already married. But in any case, I see. Okay, but again, like I said, Lizzie's just not convinced of all of this, and poor Jane is like, well, even if you are right, I'd feel bad to marry somebody whose family doesn't want me to marry him, and again, Elizabeth is just like, don't worry about it. It appeared to her merely the suggestion of Caroline's interested wishes, and she could not for a moment suppose that those wishes, however openly or artfully spoken, could influence a young man so totally independent of everyone. But, again, Lizzie's ain't wrong about any of this. We find that out later. But that's pretty much the end of chapter 21. And we could, we could probably make it to, if I keep going, I could finish the whole first volume here.
I think you're on a good roll. I like your pace today.
All right, so in any case, that's pretty much the end of that. And actually, before I get into chapter 22, the sisters decide not to tell their mother, Mrs. Bennet, about the Bingleys being gone, because it's just going to make her more upset and it's just going to make it worse. So they decide not to tell her. But then this happens. In chapter 22, the Bennets are at the Lucas's house. They go to have dinner with Sir William and Lady Lucas and Charlotte Lucas. And they bring Mr. Collins along. And again, Charlotte is kind of keeps Mr. Collins' attention, and Lizzie and the other girls are really happy about this, so they don't have to listen to him. And so Elizabeth feels really, she says, this was very amiable But Charlotte's kindness extended farther than Elizabeth had any conception of. Its object was nothing less than to secure her from any return of Mr. Collins's addresses by engaging them towards herself. And so Charlotte is purposefully keeping Mr. Collins's attention so that maybe she can marry Mr. Collins. Now, Charlotte, and I believe that we've talked about Charlotte before, Charlotte is actually a lot more practical than Lizzie or Jane. She knows the way of things, and she knows that she's got to marry somebody with decent money and a house in order for her to live comfortably. Because again, and back in these days, an old maid was very much looked down upon. And an old maid, once her parents are gone, there's nowhere for her to go. Like maybe she could go to a sister's house or a brother's house or something, but they have to be married too. So the situation for an old maid was always very precarious. And so in order to keep that from happening, you had to get married. And so again, as we mentioned before, Charlotte's 27 years old, which back in the Regency period, she might as well have been 45. Because 27 was considered way past marrying age. But in any case, anyway, she's working on Mr. Collins because she wants to have a place for herself, and she wants to leave. She wants to have her own house. And she was, and it says that she was very, that she was encouraging and. She was pretty sure that she was being successful, but the very next morning, Mr. Collins sneaks out of Longbourn and goes to Lucas Lodge and asks Charlotte to marry him. And of course she says yes. And there's this nice little what was it? I'll miss it. Anyway, but Charlotte knows that Mr. Collins is not exactly a prize, other than a prize idiot. And she knows that. She says, Mr. Collins, to be sure, was neither sensible nor agreeable. His society was irksome, and his attachment to her must be imaginary. But still, he would be her husband. Without thinking highly either of men or of matrimony, marriage had always been her object. It was the only honorable provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. This preservative she had now obtained, and at the age of 27, without having ever been handsome, she felt all the good luck of it. The least agreeable circumstance in the business was the surprise it must occasion to Elizabeth Bennet, whose friendship she valued beyond that of any other person. So, Charlotte knows he's an idiot, but at least she's not going to be an old maid now. And at least she's going to have her own place. And it says here that she doesn't think highly of men or matrimony. And so it's going to be easier for her to kind of cop out, as it were, and just get married to get married. And that's basically what she's doing here. And but she's worried about Elizabeth because she and Elizabeth are very close friends. Because Charlotte is very clever, she's very smart too, and so is Lizzie. And they probably don't have many other women like that around to talk to, and so they're important to each other. And so in any case, or they don't see that many women, because remember back in those days, women were very confined. They didn't go very far for the most part. But in any case, Charlotte's getting married to Mr. Collins. Charlotte's worried about what what Lizzie's going to say. But after the engagement and all that, and the Lucases have given their consent and everything, Mr. Collins goes back to Longbourn for supper, and they're all really surprised when Mrs. Bennet, he's going to leave the next day, and so Mrs. Bennet, before they all go to bed, says, "Oh, well, we're happy to have you. Come back whenever you can," and they're all really amazed that Mr. Collins seems really excited by this prospect, because Charlotte has told him not to say anything about their engagement, and so he's keeping his word, luckily, so they don't know what's going on, but so they're really surprised that he's excited to come back, and Mrs. Bennet thinks that the reason why he's being so affable about this is because, maybe now he wants to ask one of the other girls to marry him, and we get this little bit. Poor Mary, Mary might have been prevailed on to accept him. She rated his abilities much higher than any of the others. There was a solidity in his reflections which often struck her, and though by no means so clever as herself, she thought that, if encouraged to read and improve himself by such an example as hers, he might become a very, very agreeable companion. But so Mary was all right with the idea of Mr. Collins, and actually, I think there's actually a sort of a fan fiction book from Mary's point of view, but in any case, because she's like almost not there in the whole book, but in any case, so poor Mary has her hopes dashed the very next morning when Sir William Lucas comes in and makes the announcement to the Longbourn family, and oh no, that's not it. First, Charlotte tells Lizzie. That's right. Okay. Charlotte comes over and she tells Lizzie about getting married to Mr. Collins, and we get like a little hint from Charlotte about Lizzie's defect, which is the prejudice part. Why should you be surprised, my dear Eliza? Do you think it incredible that Mr. Collins should be able to procure any woman's good opinion, because he was not so happy as to succeed with you? And she says, "I see what you are feeling," replied Charlotte. "You must be surprised, very much surprised, so lately as Mr. Collins was wishing to marry you. But when you have had time to think it all over, I hope you will be satisfied with what I have done. I am not romantic, I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connections, and situation in life, I'm convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." So again, Charlotte is super practical about this whole thing. It's like, well, I'm sure I'm every bit as happy as anybody else in the way that marriage is now, and so I'm fine with it. And the chapter ends with this little bit here. This is kind of how Elizabeth feels about Charlotte marrying him. She says, "The strangeness of Mr. Collins making 2 offers of marriage within 3 days was nothing in comparison of his being now accepted. She had always felt that Charlotte's opinion of matrimony was not exactly like her own, but she could not have supposed it possible that, when called into action, she would have sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. Charlotte, the wife of Mr. Collins, was a most humiliating picture, and to the pang of a friend disgracing herself and sunk in her esteem was added the distressing conviction that it was impossible for that friend to be tolerably happy in the lot she had chosen." So again, here's Lizzie being prejudiced about it. She knows that she doesn't think like Charlotte, but she still is mortified by the idea, because she's convinced that Charlotte's not going to be happy, and so she's worried about it. But that's how we end chapter 23, or chapter 22 rather. Chapter 20.
How many more we got in this
One more.
volume?
And that's the
One
end
more.
of volume the first. All right.
I like this. I like this style today. You're covering a good clip.
Yeah, I take too. I know I get too detailed. I know. I'm trying to work on it.
No. This is just right. This is how it should be.
All right. Well, chapter 23. All right, so this is when Sir William comes in and tells the Longbourn family. And this is the first time that the family's hearing about it. Lizzie has heard it, but nobody else has. And poor Lydia, and everybody is amazed by this. Like, Mrs. Bennet can't believe it. Lydia can't. None of the women can believe what he's saying, that Charlotte's marrying Mr. Collins. And Lydia, who has absolutely no propriety, says, "Good Lord, Sir William, how can you tell such a story? Do not you know that Mr. Collins wants to marry Lizzie? Nothing less than the complaisance of a courtier could have borne without anger such treatment. But Sir William's good breeding carried him through it all, and though he begged leave to be positive as to the truth of his information, he listened to all their impertinence with the most forbearing courtesy, so nobody's believing him, until Elizabeth finally said, feeling it incumbent on her to relieve him from so unpleasant a situation, now put herself forward to confirm his account, by mentioning her prior knowledge of it from Charlotte herself, and endeavoured to put a stop to the exclamations of her mother and sisters by the earnestness of her congratulations to Sir William." So you see Lizzie and Jane doing this quite a lot. And this is a nice little example of why the Bennet family, why some people consider them kind of low. Because the mother is so indulgent of the girls, like they don't think before they speak. And you see Elizabeth doing this a lot. You see her kind of, like you've seen her do it at Netherfield when her mother came to visit Jane when she was sick, and when her mother kind of bows up against Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth's the one who tries to kind of rein it in. And this is Elizabeth trying to rein everything in again. It's like, y'all are stepping outside of propriety now, and so I need to step in and be the frickin' lady. Thank you so much. You know, Elizabeth and Jane have to do this a lot. But in any case, so basically she confirms what Sir William says. And Mrs. Bennet couldn't say anything. She can't say anything at all until Sir William leaves. And as soon as Sir William Lucas leaves the house, Mrs. Bennet starts in. She's pitching a fit. And she says, no sooner had he left them than her feelings found a rapid vent. She said she doesn't want to believe it, first of all, and she's convinced that Charlotte has somehow tricked him into doing this, and that she doesn't believe that they're ever going to be happy together, and she's sure that they won't actually get married. The match will be broken off. And through these four things, Mrs. Bennet said that as far as Mrs. Bennet, two inferences were plainly deduced from the whole. One, that Elizabeth was the real cause of all the mischief, and the other, that she herself had been barbarously used by them all. So Mrs. Bennet just feels like everybody is against her. And Elizabeth is this horrible daughter, and everybody's doing this despite her. That's the definition of being self-centered. But in any case, she just keeps on and on and on. Mr. Bennet I like this little bit about Mr. Bennet. He says, Mr. Bennet's emotions were much more tranquil on the occasion. And such as he did experience, he pronounced to be of a most agreeable sort. For it gratified him, he said, to discover that Charlotte Lucas, whom he had been used to think tolerably sensible, was as foolish as his wife, and more foolish than his daughter. And so I like that little bit. So in any case, Lady Lucas, we had this little bit about Lady Lucas is paying more attention than ever to how long Mr. Bennet might live, so that Mr. Collins and her daughter could take over Longbourn. And let me see here, and it says too that that Elizabeth and Charlotte they're a little bit strained right now because Charlotte knows that Lizzie thinks she's out of her mind, and is that sort of thing. But they're a little bit worried. Let me see here. Okay, and this kind of just goes through this. Okay, about a few months later, it just kind of speeds through time here, which, by the way, Jane Austen is extremely good at. As a writer, I can tell you that transitions and quick passage of time are extremely difficult to do well. And if you ever get in a tight spot and can't figure out what to do, read Jane Austen and read Charlotte Bronte. They pass time beautifully. And
can you identify why that's so difficult and what their techniques are that allow them to do it so well?
It's difficult because you're having to you're completely switching gears, and you don't want to spend too much time doing it, because it'll bog down the story and the reader will forget what you were talking about in the first place. And so it's really difficult to do. It's difficult for me. I'm sure that some writers can do it like that, but I can't. Like, my strong point is dialogue and things like that. Everybody's got a strong point. But the way that they do it is, like, they pick out somewhat, like fairly significant little things and just cover it really quickly. It's like that Jane had sent Caroline an early answer to her letter and was counting the days till she might reasonably hope to hear again. And like stuff like that, and she'll spend a couple of sentences on that, and then she'll switch to something else. After just discharging his conscience on that head, he proceeded to inform them, the promised letter of thanks from Mr. Collins arrived on Tuesday, addressed to her father. And that's just really just quick little snippets of important things that keep moving the story along, that they don't get into they don't get too deeply into. That's how they do it. And it's hard for, and like I say, it's hard for me to do it. But that's what I do, is like I'll read chapter 10 of Jane Eyre, and I'm like, okay, I got it now. so anyway, to keep on, she passes time here, and Mr. Collins shows back up to Longbourn because he's visiting now that he's engaged to Charlotte Lucas. And during this time, Mrs. Bennet has begun to realize that Mr. Bingley's not back yet. And now, adding to all of her freaking out about Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas and Elizabeth, she's freaking out about Mr. Bingley too. Even Elizabeth began to fear, not that Bingley was indifferent, but that his sisters would be successful in keeping him away. Unwilling as she was to admit an idea so destructive of Jane's happiness and so dishonorable to the stability of her lover, she could not prevent its frequently recurring. The united efforts of his two unfeeling sisters and of his overpowering friend, assisted by the attractions of Miss Darcy and the amusements of London, might be too much, she feared, for the strength of his attachment. So Lizzie's now starting to get worried because under the influence of his friends and sisters and London's, there's a lot more to do in London, and yes, Miss Darcy is probably very pretty and accomplished and everything, and so Lizzie's worried. As for Jane, her anxiety under the suspense was, of course, more painful than Elizabeth's, but whatever she felt, she was desirous of concealing. And between herself and Elizabeth, therefore, the subject was never alluded to. But as no such delicacy restrained her mother, an hour seldom passed in which she did not talk of Bingley, express her impatience for his arrival, or even require Jane to confess that if he did not come back, she should think herself very ill-used. It needed all Jane's steady mildness to bear these attacks with tolerable tranquillity. So you see the damage that the mother can do here. And not only has she produced Lydia and Kitty, who are extremely untamed, unsophisticated girls, but she goes on and on about things not with no regard to people's feelings about them. So Jane, who she says she loves so much and who's so important to her, every time that she complains about Mr. Bingley, she's hurting Jane. And it's making her, it's just making everything seem closer to Jane. And so it's just, it's just not doing well. I mean, Mrs. Bennet is not only is she an idiot, but she's also kind of unfeeling. But in any case, Mr. Collins comes back, and again, Mrs. Bennet is just freaking out over everything, and she's just not in a good mood. She says, Mrs. Bennet was really in a most pitiable state. The very mention of anything concerning the match threw her into an agony of ill humor, and wherever she went she was sure of hearing it talked of. The sight of Miss Lucas was odious to her. As her successor in that house, she regarded her with jealous abhorrence. Whenever Charlotte came to see them, she concluded her to be anticipating the hour of possession, and whenever she spoke in a low voice to Mr. Collins, was convinced that they were talking of Longbourn Estate, and resolving to turn herself and her daughters out of the house as soon as Mr. Bennet was dead. She complained bitterly of all this to her husband. And again, she does the same thing to Mr. Bennet. And basically she says, indeed, Mr. Bennet, it's very hard to think that Charlotte Lucas should ever be mistress of this house, that I should be forced to make way for her and live to see her take my place in it. And my dear, do not give way to such gloomy thoughts. This is Mr. Bennet. Let us hope for better things. Let us flatter ourselves that I may be the survivor. And again, although this is kind of funny, it's really mean too. I mean, seriously, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet just abuse the crap out of each other verbally. I mean, and Mrs. Bennet, because she's so stupid, and everything somehow connected to her, everything is an abuse to her. And maybe she doesn't really realize that she's hurting people, but Mr. Bennet, like, he does it just out of amusement. And in some ways, he's even worse. But at the same time, it's this whole thing of, well, if she's too stupid to realize it, then, it's her fault or something. I don't know what. It's one of those. Like, the parents here are not very good, and so they're not great parents. And so basically, and Mrs. Bennet says, I cannot bear to think that they should have all this estate. If it was not for the entail, I should not mind it. Which basically means I should not mind you dying if it weren't for the entail. And basically, that's just too much. That's pretty much the end of the chapter right there, is Mr. and Mrs. Bennet kind of lamenting over this, or Mrs. Bennet lamenting over the entail, and Mr. Bennet just continuing to read. And so that's the end of volume the first. And
that's awesome.
And so just, to recap, again, we got Mr. Collins, and we're beginning to see the politics of marriage in the Regency era among the gentry. It's all politics. It really is. It's all about money and name. It's about how people can maintain a certain way of life. Okay, and for a for a gentleman's daughter or gentleman to have to start doing servants work or don't have a great house anymore, it gets, it's a great shame back in those days, and that's the last thing anybody wanted. And so and you also see how the parents just make it worse, in that, they're trying to get their kids, trying to keep their kids established in some way, and they don't always really care how happy it makes the kids. And so, it's all, like I said, you got to look at Pride and Prejudice as a comedy of manners, but it's also a satire. It's also a light shown on the hypocrisy and how ridiculous the gentry is, and the people, how ridiculous this whole system is. And we have these characters who are basically caricatures and stereotypes. And the writers use stereotypes to make a point, and that's what she's doing here. But in any case, that's the end of volume the first, and volume the second, that's when stuff really starts hitting the fan. So,
it's interesting you're talking about the satirical nature of all this. Was this book received as controversial at all? I mean, did people understand the critique that it was getting?
I think, Pride and Prejudice is my understanding, it was very popular when it came out. And again, at this point in history, Anne Radcliffe has started to write, and it was still sort of unusual for a woman to be a writer. And so if there was if there was any controversy, then it was probably on that end. But again, it was very popular when it came out.
So it was kind of interesting that then her critique was kind of able to lodge itself in the subconscious of people because they were distracted by other controversies, and then they could kind of absorb, like, hey, maybe it is kind of ridiculous.
Exactly, and we got to remember that Jane Austen herself was embroiled in this whole thing, because and her family was poor. Her family, they weren't like servants or one of the lower classes. They were gentry, but they were poor. And so she got to see all of this, and it's like in high school. It's like when you're in high school, you're a student in high school, and you see how people behave, and you see the cliquiness and all the different things that happen with the different groups of friends and everything, and you sit back and you say, this is so freaking stupid. Everybody feels that way in high school. Everybody. I think. I hope. But everybody sees it. But that's the system, and you don't know how to change it, and you don't know how to live outside of it. And that's kind of, I think, what Pride and Prejudice would have been like for the gentry. It's like, Jane, stop this crazy thing, they couldn't get off of this ride. but they could see that it was ridiculous. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah. I kind of wish we had gone to high school together.
Yeah. I was a band geek, dude, so.
Were you?
Yeah.
Yeah. That would have been cool. Kind of, yeah, would have been fun.
I was the champion of the weirdos.
Oh, you do not out weird Luke Johnson. You would have had some competition for that yearbook superlative. That was eccentric to say the least. All right. Hey, great job. Keep doing what you're doing. I'll have this edited and put up probably tomorrow. Just given the order of everything. I want to thank you everybody for listening and going deep into it with us. And you can find this on YouTube, SoundCloud, Noetic app, and we'll just keep on building. I think Jennifer and I are talking about maybe recreating an Ibsen audio play at some point if we can just decide on what we want to do.
Yep.
So I might let her decide what that is. All right. I'll talk to you later, Jen.
Thanks. Bye.